Hello and welcome, I'm JD and this is the new player's guide for Nebulous Fleet Command. This video has been made after the modular missile update, so some things may change with balance tweaks and later updates. So I've been putting off making this video as there has been a lot that I have wanted to include in it, and previously I just haven't found a format that I was able to present it in. And so what I've decided to focus on is your first few games and your first few hours within Nebulous Fleet Command. So first of all, I absolutely recommend that you do the tutorial. So come into campaigns and tutorials. Later on, the conquest game mode and the story game mode will both be in here. But if we go through to the Fleet Academy, and so you'll be presented with lessons 1 through 8, which will each cover their own topics. I won't go through all of them, but I would say on lesson 6, when it's asking you to waypoint missiles around to certain points, to defeat the final ships. If you are unable to do that, that's okay. It's meant to be an advanced tactic, so you can always come back to it later on, and it does allow you to get straight back into it without having to listen to all the preamble. Likewise, I'd consider lesson 7 to be optional. I definitely recommend you do it, however you can come back to it. Otherwise, do all the other lessons. They'll give you all the basics that will enable you to play the game. One thing that I'll mention here is that if Lieutenant Hazel is going a little bit too fast for you in the tutorial, or if you want to go back and reread what she said, then what you can do is come into the menu by pressing the escape key, come down to message log, and from there you'll have a log of everything that has been said to date, so you can simply reread that, and as more messages are added, then you can simply use the scroll wheel to go back and find what you're looking for. Once you've completed the tutorial, the next thing that you'll want to do is get in a few skirmish games. So again, coming back into the single player option and down to skirmish, you're then presented with the ability to create a local game within the match lobby. So I would recommend playing on the cliffs as your first map. It's a 2v2 style map. And then later on, once you're a little bit more comfortable, you can come over to pillars, which is one of the most frequently played game maps. The default scenario is control, and again, that's what you'll play mostly in multiplayer until conquest mode comes along. And so I reckon that you actually play on this game mode as it gives you an objective to play around. If you play one of the other modes, such as annihilation, you'll find that sometimes certain fleets don't stack up very well against other fleets, as they are very much asymmetrical in design. And so I also suggest you set a time limit. So 45 or 60 minutes is very much the norm, and as many victory points as you want. Usually 1,000 points or 1,500 points is, again, generally the objectives that are set. And this allows you, again, to play the objective and therefore have a time limit, which will eventually run out if you are unable to achieve the victory points. But most of the time, the victory points are achieved before the time limit runs out. So with the game map set and the objective set, we now want to have a look at the actual lobby and the teams. Now, most of the games played within Nebulous Fleet Command center around a 3,000 point limit, and that's what all the starter fleets are currently set at. The reason being, it requires trade-offs when designing a fleet, so you can't simply take one of everything, and you do have to make design sacrifices. It keeps that playstyle a little bit fresh. So you're not forced into playing at 3,000 points. You can set a limit to whatever you want. However, most players will have a 3,000 point fleet handy. If you want to play something else later on in multiplayer, then you just need to change that points limit round. If you're playing in skirmish mode, you can play whatever you want. One of the things that I see in the Discord is a lot of players, when they're starting out, want to play a 1v1 versus the computer. But Nebulous Fleet Command, especially at the 3,000 point fleet size, isn't really designed both in maps and objectives for a 1v1 style of gameplay. And so what I would recommend is that you add in additional computer players both onto your team and the other team, and so that you're able to play the way that the game is intended, particularly for the objective and for the maps that are available. If you're playing on pillars, then I would also suggest that you add in, again, enough computer players or AI until you have all the player slots filled up. This will just take up some of the battle space. It'll make it feel a little bit more natural when you then move on to multiplayer later on, and it will enable certain things such as having balanced teams where you're able to use a variety of different fleets to cover each other's weaknesses. And so if we return to the cliff and we have our 4 players set up, including ourselves, the next thing is picking which starter fleets to go for. And so for the purposes of still setting up this scenario, we'll pick between Oak, Birch, Hemlock, and Epsilon, as they are the easiest to both play with and against when you're starting out. And that's because they are all around smaller fleet sizes, and so that you don't have to worry about maneuvering too many different ships. You can just focus on 2 or 3 ships and really focus on the basics. They're not overbearing in any weapon or particular mechanic. So even though they'll have a mix of missiles, electronic warfare, cannons, and beams, then none of the fleets are specialized in all of them. So you should be able to both counter and play with each of them without it feeling like one of them is doing a lot better than what you're currently bringing. And because a lot of them are centered around a heavier class of ship, being either the heavy cruiser or the light cruiser, they have a bit of longevity and survivability. And so one of the things that you don't want to feel like as a newer player is that it takes 1 or 2 shots, then your ship is dead, and that basically ends the game for you. You want to have that longevity and survivability early on, so you can take a few hits. It will sting a little bit, however, it does give you time to move back into cover or to move away or to employ a countermeasure or electronic warfare to get yourself out of a situation instead of simply just being destroyed in open space. And so here we're going to have a mix of those 4 fleets. And so we're going to take Task Force Oak as my fleet. We'll give Task Force Birch to CPU 12. We're then going to give Task Fleet Hemlock as my ally. And if we come across to the opposition's ally, we'll give them Epsilon. So now that we have our 4 fleets, we can actually go into our first game. So when you spawn into your first game, you'll have yourself on team 1, your enemy on team 2. You can see where your friendlies are deploying based on the blue arrow. So this one here is Epsilon. It says the name of the main ship and then how many escorts are in that formation. So you know that there are 3 ships now deploying in at the same time. And as you move around the tactical map, you can see all the control points with the enemy spawning behind point E. So we'll deploy both our Task Force Oak in the middle so that they can cover each other, and we'll go for one of the control points. And so this won't be a full playthrough, just I want to touch on a few points whilst we enter the game. So when you deploy, you can immediately see that because we've populated the map with enough ships, we're immediately getting the ability to detect some of the enemy. So whilst I do some talking, I will also position my ships together. And so as a new player, you want to take the time to make those decisions that will enable you to learn best. So if you want, you can always slow down or pause time by pressing Control and the spacebar. And then you'll see that there is blinking text on the screen telling you at what timescale the game is going at. So it's currently operating at 25% of the norm, as well as up in the top with the time dilation indicator. You can change the timescale from 50% down to 1% of normal time. Or if you want to freeze the game, you can set it to 0. And so you can do that by coming into game settings by pressing the escape button, into settings and accessibility, and then you have the active pause speed. So this will always come enabled by default, but you can then use this slider to change how fast or slow you want that time to go. So do I want it to be at 50% of the game speed, or do I want to freeze it? Here I'll set it at 50%, so it just gives me a little bit of extra time. And you can see that all our ships are going to move a little bit slower. And if I wanted to return to normal time after giving some orders, so let's give some orders for my guns, then I can return to normal speed by pressing Control spacebar. When you're a new player, give yourself that time to make those decisions by pressing the active pause, make those decisions, figure out what's the best to do or the best way to counter it, because these early games are about you learning and not necessarily about you winning. Nebulous Fleet Command is very much a situational game, so even though sometimes you may take these fleets and do absolutely well, there'll also be times where you take the exact same fleet and you don't do so well. Remember, the enemy always gets a say, and so do your teammates. And so here we have our ally taking one of the points, we're moving to one of the other points, and we've got some enemy as well. Now, your first few games, you want to just get comfortable with everything, such as moving in 3-dimensional space, using things like waypoints and the different tools, being familiar with all the different orders within the panel. So what type of weapons, switching ammunition, do you want to use point defense and decoys, being able to lock enemy targets, all the different movement orders, just try them out, see how they operate and feel for you. The different signals so that you can give to your teammates, such as move here, defend there. Ones such as using the TRP that you'll have from the TRP lesson. One thing that you also want to be able to get familiar with is the signal priority. It just highlights to your team that you've determined that that is a higher priority target, and let's go for that one first. And whilst I'm here with a 50% timescale, just also identifying that what is a dead ship. This space oil here will identify that this ship here is dead, and it will be released when a ship has been determined that it is dead. you'll see then about 30 seconds later, after this oil has been released, that life pods will start to be ejected, which is just occurring now. So being able to identify when a ship is dead is always important. So now you can come right click signal and mark it as killed, and therefore the rest of your team knows not to continue to fire at it. Other things you want to be familiar with is things such as the damage control board, just being able to read that, noting that you have all these different toggles to highlight different things, making sure that you know how to set priorities for both damage control as well as issuing a restore, and then all the different options that you have down on the bottom left-hand UI panel that changes things such as your throttle speed, your maneuver, whether you have anything that can be battle shorted, turning your radar and communications on and off like you learned in the tutorials, the weapons control settings, as well as getting familiar with all your point defense. Once you've set up your first skirmish game, what you want to be able to do is just play through all the different fleets in your own time, get a feel for them all, understand how they operate, build yourself up from cliffs up to pillars, add in all the different fleets, and then you want to play with them all. And so with that said, let's go from the easiest to the hardest, the starter fleets to both play with and against. And so I've broken these up into groupings where they naturally sort of fit together, but also so that I can give you a focus on what to learn for when you're playing with each of these fleets. So the first two we've sort of touched on, Oak and Birch are by far the easiest ones to play with. And that's because the ships are basically carbon copies of each other. So the two heavy cruisers in Task Fleet Oak are effectively one ship build, and you're using two of them. And in Task Force Birch, you've got the three light cruisers basically in the same build again. However, one of them has a different radar to the other two. Otherwise, you're effectively playing the same ship 3 times. You don't have to worry about all the different functionalities or intricacies when you're playing these ships. They also all focus on one weapon system, and that is cannons. So the Task Force Oak is taking the 450mm cannons, basically use that to focus on anything from destroyers up to battleships. And for Task Force Birch, you can use your 250mm cannons and the various ammo types, target anything from basically corvettes up to heavy cruisers with the 250mm AP at that higher end. And so this makes it very easy to enable you to focus on the core mechanics of the game without having to worry about the intricacies of the weapons. And so finally, they're all a bit survivable. Task Force Oak firing at Task Force Birch and vice versa. They will last a while. They will do damage to each other. However, you're not going to immediately be punished for stepping out of cover. And this is something that you want to do as a new player because it is frustrating once your smaller ships are immediately destroyed by a well-placed salvo or well-placed missile, then you don't have anything else to play with. So do let you make mistakes and are a little bit more forgiving. And I've run both of these online in multiplayer games with no edits. You can see them on this channel under the Starter Fleet Battles. And you can see that they do fairly well, just stock standard. So when you're playing at Task Force Oak and Birch, your main focus is just the gameplay basics that you would have learned in the tutorial. Focus on your movement, focusing on your positioning, such as using cover, using the heading and the roll commands. Just focus on things such as target selection, by what do you want to use your cannons on? Are you working with your teammate or your ally, or are you shooting at something and then you're noticing that you keep missing? Make sure that you learn how to switch the ammo types as well, and then just navigate that whole UI down the bottom, damage control board, the various toggles that enable you to use your fleet. And once you feel comfortable doing that, then you can effectively take the next step and move on to Hemlock and Epsilon. So Hemlock and Epsilon start to diverge and become that mixed fleet. No longer do you have a carbon copy of each other. You now have this mixed fleet, and they both center around a heavy platform, so being a heavy cruiser. Hemlock has a 450mm gun, a beam and missiles, and then Epsilon is again all guns. However, you then also have supporting elements. So in both of these, you have a scout corvette, and then you also have in Hemlock a corvette equipped with an electronic warfare, and you also then have a light cruiser which has electronic warfare for Epsilon. So this enables you to start to get into scouting by sending a corvette ahead of your main ships, identifying the enemy, holding your major assets, being the heavy cruisers, back a little bit, and you don't have to walk blindly into the middle to find the enemy like you would have with the previous two. You also have more diverse weapons, so you can start to see how the missiles and the beams interact. It means you have the ability to split fire onto multiple different targets, and you want to start to be able to use this again with your target selection, making sure you're putting the right amount of fire on the right thing, making sure something's dead before moving on to something else. And we finally start to introduce electronic warfare. Both Hemlock and Epsilon will have, I think, either one or two blanket jammers each. So if you remember back to your radar tutorial, then if you are being jammed, then you want to use your burn through, which your heavy cruisers should have, and then you can apply your bullseye or your locking capabilities in order to maintain that target through the jamming. Or if you're the one who has the jammer, then you want to be able to jam your enemies so that you're able to either use your missiles or position your fleet in such a way that you're able to attack. And so your focus on Hemlock and Epsilon is one, the electronic warfare game, just getting familiar with the jamming and the counter jamming gameplay. With one or two on each team, if you break these types of fleets up between the AI, both on your team and the enemy team, it won't be overbearing. You'll be able to burn through the jamming as that they won't be stacking them too hard. So you'll be able to find the enemy, lock the enemy, and then return fire with your weapons. And this will serve you later on when you get into multiplayer and people bring more of them. And you also then want to get into that practice of scouting for the enemy, using that Corvette, positioning it to find an enemy, ranging it ahead of your larger ships. Once you have that knowledge, then deciding what you want to do with your other ships in order to make that attack. Task Force Redwood and Task Force Willow sit in the middle of the easiest to hardest scale. And this is for two main reasons. One, it is centered around a main ship with enablers. So in this case, we have two heavy cruisers, and then we're supported by either corvettes or frigates and a destroyer. Now, the smaller ships are very susceptible to 250mm fire from things such as Task Force Birch. It can be taken out quite easily. However, you also need those ships to support your main ships, being the heavy cruisers. Now, railguns in themselves are meant to be long-range support weapons. You don't want to be getting up close and personal like you would with the previous four fleets. And so that will require a bit of a mindset shift. You want to be sitting back, positioning your ships either to cover a point or to deny an enemy a particular corridor to advance through, so that if they do, your scouts see them, you put a lock on them, and then you can start firing. And if they want to move through that space, well, then they're going to be fired at the whole time, and they may not be able to return fire at you. That tactic can easily be defeated if you lose those scouts. And one of the easiest way to lose scouts is by putting them in a vulnerable position. And also we start to introduce missiles as more of a primary weapon. So both Task Force Redwood and Willow start to have more missiles than you would have been used to in the previous four starter fleets, in which Hemlock was the only one that had, I think, 16 missiles. Once you use them all, that was it. You actually have more of them now. You have different types of abilities to guide those missiles onto the target, and they also take up a fair amount of points. So if you're losing the frigates and the corvettes early on, not only are you losing the ability to find the enemy, but you're also losing the ability to put missiles on the enemy, and you're starting to become fairly weak with each ship's death. So your focus here is scouting to enable your other weapons. So using one of your corvettes or your frigates, find the other enemy ships so that you can put missiles and rails onto them. You also need to focus on that advanced positioning. So making sure that your soft ships, such as your corvettes and your frigates, are safe but able to see the enemy, but also that your rail ships are in a position when you find that enemy to put fire onto them. And with your missiles, you really want to start to find that target selection. So how many missiles am I firing? What type of point defense does the enemy have? Am I able to bypass that? The correct application of missiles, whether it be size 1, size 2, size 3, or various hybrids. And then you want to be able to use your waypointing techniques so that you're able to remain out of harm's way, but launch your missiles around various objects and terrain. And then your timing too. You don't have to launch your missiles the minute you see the enemy. You want to be able to confirm what that target is. Make sure that you're firing it at the opportune time. Do I do it now when an ally is firing, or do I want to wait until I've softened up the point defense on that ship with my rail guns first, and then I'll launch my missiles? And then you'll start to get that feel of at what time should I be launching and how many should I be launching. Task Force Sycamore, moving up one more level. A very diverse fleet here, 2 frigates, 3 corvettes. Missiles are the primary weapon system here, so you really need to look after these hulls to make sure that you're able to have all your missiles when you're ready and when they're needed, and you want to be able to do them in coordinated strikes. And so we're going from firing missiles in simply either the direct mode or at waypoints, and we may just be doing that with one corvette after another. What you want to be able to do and focus on here with Task Force Sycamore is that you want to be able to start to learn how to do coordinated missile strikes, ideally from 2 or more directions at the same time, whether that be direct or waypoints or a combinations of both, so that when you're landing your missiles on target, the enemy's point defense is now starting to have to focus on group 1, then group 2, then group 3, and you should land some of your missiles on target. You're also starting to get some more diverse methods of missiles, so you've got to also learn how to use them, such as the frigate, the Eye of Providence in the foreground, has an illuminator on its bottom mount, so you want to be able to launch your missiles and then engage that illuminator at the appropriate time so that you are able to paint the target and therefore guide the missiles onto that target. If you're too early or too late, therefore your missile strike may fail because the missiles were unable to pick up the illuminator and be guided onto the target. Finally, the hardest fleet to play both with and against is Task Force Ash. And the reason that is because this is an ambushing fleet. Now, people will immediately focus down beam destroyers when they find them. Once you get within that 6-kilometer range, they can do a fair amount of damage very, very quickly. So with Task Force Ash, you need to be able to remain undetected when moving into position, and that could be through a combination of smart positioning in both your movement, your terrain identification, and things such as using jammers. And then when you're in position, you want to make sure that you're always ready to ambush, and you do that by having all of the ships always focusing in a way that they may be able to target. So if you move around in a terrain piece, then you don't want to do so without your beams already facing in a way that they may start to engage. Because if you don't do that, then you've got to take time to turn on to target, and therefore the enemy can get the jump back at you. And then in addition, not only do you have beams to worry about, but you also have smaller missiles and smaller guns, as well as electronic warfare. So there's a lot of things to do in a small fleet of 4 ships. And you can either do really, really well, or you can be punished for a small mistake. And that's why Task Force Ash is both the hardest to play with and against, because if you're coming up against Task Force Ash and you're not doing appropriate scouting, then you're letting the enemy get into that ambushing position, and they will quickly destroy even large ships such as heavy cruisers and battleships with their beams. Here, your focus is on having that advanced movement and positioning, making sure that you're always ready to attack. And when you do, you'll find that this fleet is one of the strongest fleets that you pretty much don't need to modify. You can just take it straight into battle and it will work almost 90% of the time if you are comfortable with using the beams and the methodology to get the results. So once you've played through all these fleets, you should be fairly comfortable now with not only operating all the different hull types, operating all the different weapon types, but also the UI and the mechanics and the game mechanics in order to move out of skirmish mode and into multiplayer. There's nothing wrong with continuing to refine your playstyle within the single player mode, and we're coming back to it. However, you'll find that once you've been able to beat the AI consistently, you've sort of hit a ceiling there, and the best way to then continue to develop your playstyle as well as your fleets is to then take it to multiplayer. And for some people, that may be a little bit daunting until things such as Conquest mode or Story mode come along and lets you play through that. However, it isn't, and you shouldn't be deterred to jump into multiplayer because the community is generally very friendly. Lots of people who will want to help you out, both in learning as well as your shipbuilding and just giving you little bits of knowledge. So if you want, there's always the Discord that you can pop into and and say hello, let people know that you're new and ask for tips, and you'll find that most people are very welcome to assist you. So before you just jump into multiplayer and we start talking about that, let's talk about your fleets. Up to this point, you've played with starter fleets only. Now you can take your starter fleets directly into multiplayer. Like I said, there's games where I've been playing them and they're absolutely fine. However, if you want to start to build your own fleets, you want to come into the fleet editor, and I've got some mods installed here, but you'll start with the Alliance. Eventually we'll get a second faction, which will play completely different with their own weapons. And that's the Outlying Systems Protectorate. And hopefully they come out soon because I'm really excited for that. So if we come in here, there are a lot of options, both in terms of all the different components. You've got all the different hulls to select from, and you're wondering, well, where do I start? And so my advice is, pick a starter fleet that you enjoyed playing based on a particular hull or based on a particular weapon system, and take that and load it up and start to modify it. And from there, make sure that you save it as a new starter fleet. If you do accidentally save over your starter fleet, you can always come back into your Steam library, right click on Nebulous Fleet Command, Properties, and under local files, come down and just verify the integrity of your game files. It'll reload all the starter fleets up as per original. However, you won't lose any of your saved fleets. So pick a fleet that you enjoy. For example, if you want to take Task Force Birch, and then you've got your 3,000 points, and you can start adding and removing things such as, I don't need all these vertical launch systems. I now have 26 points to add. Maybe I want to take in some more ammunition, and then make sure that, like I said, you save that fleet as something new, and that you're able to then find, I usually have a 00 prefix at the front, just so that it always is at the top of my fleet files when I want to then select a game for multiplayer. And then once you have that fleet that you've modified, you can then go play test that for a few games. I don't recommend making any sweeping changes based off one game, because sometimes you have a really good game and sometimes you have a not so good game, just based on the way that the game unfolds, or maybe sometimes there's a little bit of RNG with a critical event that doesn't go your way. So play test for a few times, get a bit of a feel for how you're playing, how the ships are playing. Do you need to tweak? Are you consistently losing to a particular thing, such as the cannons are always destroying my ships? Well, maybe you need more damage control. Or are you always getting destroyed by missiles? Well, maybe I need more point defense. Once you have enough data after a couple games, say at least 3, then come back into the fleet editor, make your changes again before then saving and going back out. That's just the cycle you keep going through. Pick another starter fleet, modify from there, and then once you're comfortable with building fleets, testing fleets, and adjusting them, and then start making fleets from scratch with a new fleet from the Alliance or the OSP when it comes, and just trial everything out, see how it goes. You also have the Steam Workshop, which has a whole bunch of different files that people have uploaded, so that you can just subscribe to these. They will appear within your save files, and you can see what they've built or why they've built it, how to play it. Some of them are newer, some of them are older. You do have all these filters, so you can select from different ones based on different game updates, different periods of time, and see how other people build it. And so then when you're finally ready to enter multiplayer, you just come into multiplayer, you have all your matches up. You can either join a game if it's available, or if there isn't one, simply host one yourself. Just be aware, if you are the host and you do leave a game, then it will close for everyone. Join a game. It may seem a little bit daunting, but just let people know that you're new. And people will make that concession and go, yeah, no worries, it's your first game. You know, we've all been there. One of the best things that you can do as a new player within your first few multiplayer games is actually just follow another fleet to an objective. And you'll learn, you know, is if the other player is taking something like a beam fleet or a cannon fleet, then go with them, let them take the lead, use your combined point defense to protect you from missiles. And so that way you don't bear the brunt of any attacks directly on you. It lets you maneuver around the map, have a bit of longevity. You can see how they play. You can see what they're targeting. You can use the Discord voice channels that anyone can jump into. They're all free. Jump in there. You can have a chat with people. They'll give you some advice and coordinate via voice comms. Or if you don't want to do that, because sometimes I just want to play by myself listening to some music or anything like that, I strongly suggest using the in-game text chat and the message signals, and that allows you to quickly communicate with your allies, coordinate whether you're targeting a ship or telling them that you're going to capture an objective, or they'll ask you to go capture an objective, for example, and you can go off and do that. And that's good enough to just have that bit of communication on a 4-player team in order to have a bit of a coordinated attack, as opposed to everyone going off and doing their own thing and fleets being destroyed one by one. And so once you've got to this point, you're pretty much up to speed on the majority of the game. You've got the basics down. You understand how to navigate all the UI, position your ships, use different weapon systems, build your own ships, play games with other people. And if you want to know a little bit more about the mechanics, if I was to sprout my own YouTube channel here, then I've got a whole playlist called Tutorials and Tips. We're up to 33 videos now, which covers everything from mechanics as well as small little things that people ask quite often. I'm consistently updating that in both terms of information or new information, as well as the quality. I'm going through a bit of a refresh at the moment from when I started at the beginning of the year, so just be aware that some of them will be a little bit rougher than others, but I will get through and update them all in due course. And you also then have the Discord to go ask if you have any other particular questions around anything that's on the top of your head, or if you want to request a game feature, you can do it there. People will be more than willing to help you out, answer your question, give you that knowledge transfer, and until we have a wiki or anything that is up and running. And so with that, That ends the new player's guide for Nebulous Fleet Command. It may seem quite stock standard in its approach and layout. However, these questions come up quite often within the Discord, so hopefully I've answered a few of the questions here for you, and it makes joining the game in your first few games and your first few hours a lot simpler and easier, and something that you can refer back to over time as you hit each of those milestones. So if you have any other questions, put them down in the comments below. If you're an experienced player and you have any tips, please put that down in the comments below as well, and get that knowledge transfer out there into the community. Right, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching and take care.